My mom slapped me so hard, I crashed into the wall. She spat on me, and my bill laughed while they called me a gold digger, thinking my husband was away on deployment. But when the door opened and he stepped into the room, his next words left them frozen in terror. My back hit the drywall so hard a picture frame slid off its nail and cracked against the baseboard. I was 8 months pregnant with twins, one hand still cupped over my belly, the other clutching the grocery envelope my mom had just torn out of my grip. She called it his money, like I was some opportunist who'd married a paycheck instead of a person. Like the 2 years we'd spent trying and failing to have children before this pregnancy finally took had never happened at all. My brother had lifted $40 from that same envelope 2 days earlier. Nobody had called him anything for it. He just stood in the doorway of my own living room, grinning like this was the best entertainment he'd had all month, while my mom spat on my sleeve and told me to get out of my own home before my husband came back and found out exactly what kind of woman he'd married. I want to tell you how I got here because none of this happened in one afternoon. It built for the better part of a year, one small humiliation stacked on another, until the woman standing in my living room felt entitled to put her hands on a pregnant woman and call it discipline. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was 31 years old, a freelance bookkeeper with my own client list and my own savings account, when I fell in love with a soldier who made every temporary apartment feel like something worth calling home. His name doesn't matter either. Not here. I'll just tell you he had the kind of steadiness that made hard things feel survivable. And when he proposed in a parking lot outside a base gate because neither of us wanted to wait for a fancier setting, I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. We got married quickly, quietly, the way people do when one of you might get orders that change everything with 2 weeks' notice. My mother came to the wedding. She smiled in the photos. She hugged my husband and told everyone within earshot how happy she was for us. I believed her because I wanted to, because believing the good version of my mother had always been easier than accepting the other one. The trouble didn't start with malice. It started with money, the way it usually does in families where love and finances got tangled up decades before I was even born. My mother had raised my brother and me on a strict ledger of who owed what to whom. Every gift came with an invisible invoice. Every kindness she extended got mentioned again months later, usually during an argument, as proof of everything she'd sacrificed for people who didn't appreciate her. I'd spent my 20s trying to get far enough away from that ledger that I could just live without constantly totaling up debts. And for a while, marrying a soldier and moving 3 states away had done exactly that. Then the twins came, and suddenly there was a reason for her to be involved again. We found out I was pregnant 6 months into the marriage, after almost 2 years of trying that had included more disappointment than I ever told my husband about in real time, because I didn't want him carrying that weight from an ocean away. When the test finally came back with 2 heartbeats instead of 1, I sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried until my knees ached. Not from sadness, from something closer to disbelief that my body had actually managed the thing we'd wanted for so long. My husband cried too, over a video call with terrible connection, saying our whole world just got twice as big over and over, until I started laughing at how many times he said it. He had orders already locked in for a deployment that would put him overseas for most of my pregnancy. We talked about it and decided there wasn't much choice in the timing of any of it. Babies didn't wait for convenient windows in a military calendar. My mother found out about the pregnancy 3 days after my husband did, and her first question wasn't about how I was feeling. It was about whether the government paid extra for twins and whether that meant I'd finally be comfortable enough to help out family when they needed it. I told myself she was joking. I told myself a lot of things that year. The first few months of the pregnancy were manageable. My husband called when he could, wrote letters that arrived out of order and full of half-finished sentences from exhaustion, and I settled into a routine of freelance bookkeeping work I did from our small dining table, coffee I could barely keep down some mornings, and long walks around our apartment complex to keep my blood pressure from climbing the way my doctor kept warning me about. My mother visited twice a month at first. She'd bring groceries, sit with me while I worked, ask about the babies in a way that almost felt like genuine interest. My brother came along sometimes too, usually quieter than her, usually more interested in whatever was in my refrigerator than in the actual pregnancy. The shift happened gradually enough that I didn't notice it happening in real time. It was only later, once I'd started keeping track of things, that I could look back and see the pattern clearly. It started with comments about the apartment. Nice couch, she said the first time she saw the secondhand sectional we'd found on a moving sale. Guess the military pays better than I thought. Then it became comments about my clothes, my groceries, the vitamins my doctor had prescribed. Then it became something else entirely, something with teeth in it. I don't know exactly when my mother copied the spare key. I only know that one Tuesday afternoon, 4 months into the pregnancy, I woke up from a nap to find her standing in my kitchen going through my mail. I sat up too fast, my heart hammering, and asked her how she'd gotten in. She held up a key like it was the most natural thing in the world. Your brother had one made, in case of emergencies. You should be grateful someone's looking out for you while your husband's off playing soldier. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that, because I think people reading this expect me to have fought back immediately, to have changed the locks that same day, and told her never to come back. I didn't do that. I was exhausted, hormonal, alone most of the time, and arguing with my mother had never once in my life ended with her backing down. It only ever ended with her escalating until I gave in from sheer fatigue, so I let it go. I told myself she just wanted to help. I told myself the key wasn't a big deal, that having family nearby while my husband was gone was actually a good thing, that I was being paranoid for feeling uneasy about it. My brother's borrowing started around the same time. He'd ask for $20 here, $40 there, always with a plan to pay it back that never quite materialized. A car payment he was short on, a phone bill bill that had gotten away from him. Small numbers individually, but they added up fast, and none of it ever came back to me. The first time I mentioned it to my mother, hoping she might say something to him, she waved it off entirely. He's your brother. Family helps family. You're the one married to someone with a steady paycheck now. It's the least you can do. I started noticing that phrase a lot that year. The least you can do. As though my marriage had turned me into some kind of family resource to be drawn on whenever anyone needed something, rather than a person who happened to have a spouse with a stable income and a lot of financial discipline behind it. By month 5, the visits had shifted from occasional to frequent, and frequent to invasive. My mother would let herself in while I was napping, go through the refrigerator, comment on grocery receipts left on the counter, and once, memorably, pick up a bill from my OB's office and read it aloud before I could stop her, sighing about how expensive it all was, like the expense itself was somehow my fault for needing prenatal care. My doctor flagged my blood pressure for the first time at that appointment. Not dangerously high, she said, but high enough that she wanted me managing stress more carefully going forward. I remember sitting in the exam room afterward, alone, and thinking about how much of my stress that year had a name and a key to my apartment. I called my husband that night and told him everything was fine. The babies were kicking more, I said. I'd started buying maternity clothes I actually liked instead of just whatever was cheap. I didn't mention the key, or the borrowed money, or the blood pressure. I told myself I was protecting him from worrying about things he couldn't do anything about from an ocean away. Looking back, I think I was also protecting myself from having to say the words out loud and make them real. There's a call I think about often from that period, one of the last good ones before things got difficult enough that I started hiding pieces of my life from him entirely. It was month 6, late at night for me, early morning where he was, and the connection was better than usual, clear enough that I could hear him properly instead of piecing together half of every sentence through static. He asked, the way he always did, how the babies were doing, and I told him about the ultrasound from that week, how the technician had shown us 2 profiles facing each other like they were already sharing some private conversation neither of us would ever be included in. He laughed at that, a real laugh, and told me he hoped they'd still be that close when they were teenagers arguing over the bathroom. Then he asked how I was doing, not the babies, me specifically, and I remember hesitating just slightly before answering. It wasn't a long hesitation. Probably nobody would have noticed it except someone who knew me as well as he did. You okay? He asked again, more directly this time. I'm okay, I told him, just tired. Being pregnant with twins is apparently exactly as exhausting as everyone warned me it would be. He accepted that answer because there was no reason for him not to, because I'd given him no indication that anything else was happening. We talked for another 20 minutes about baby names, about a friend of his who'd just had his first child and kept sending unsolicited advice through email, about a care package I was putting together that included the specific brand of coffee he liked that wasn't available where he was stationed. Before we hung up, he said something that has stayed with me through everything that happened afterward. You and those babies are my whole home now, he said. Wherever you are is home. I just need you to still be standing when I get back. I told him I would be. I meant it as reassurance. But looking back, I think some part of me also meant it as a promise I was making to myself. A commitment to hold on through whatever came next without letting it break anything essential in me before he made it home. I kept quiet about my mother's key that night. I kept quiet about the money my brother had borrowed, or the gold digger comments that had started creeping into every visit like something contagious. I told myself again that I was protecting him, that there was nothing useful he could do about any of it from where he was, that worrying him wouldn't fix anything, and would only add weight to days that were already heavy enough with everything a deployment required of a person. I think now that I was also protecting myself, in a way, from having to fully name what was happening. As long as I hadn't said it out loud to the person whose opinion mattered most to me, some part of me could still believe it wasn't quite as serious as it felt in the moments when I was actually living through it. The word gold digger entered the conversation for the first time in month 6, and once it existed, my mother and brother used it constantly, like they'd been saving it up for years and finally found an acceptable place to deploy it. It started as a joke, or at least that's how she framed it. We were sitting at my kitchen table, and I'd mentioned that my husband's next paycheck would cover the crib we still needed. My brother laughed and told me how nice it must be to just wait around for someone else's money to show up. My mother didn't correct him. She smiled instead, the way she used to smile when I was a teenager, and she wanted me to know she agreed with something cruel without having to say it herself. I told them both calmly that I had my own savings before I ever met my husband, that I'd worked as a freelance bookkeeper for 6 years and had clients who trusted me with real money before any of them had ever heard his name. My mother waved a hand like the fact was inconvenient to her narrative and told me none of that mattered now, since I clearly wasn't working as hard as I used to. I was 7 months pregnant with twins. I had, in fact, taken on fewer clients specifically because my doctor had told me to reduce my workload. I didn't say any of that out loud. I'd learned by then that explaining myself to my mother rarely changed anything. It just gave her more material to twist into something else later. Around this time, I met my neighbor, an older woman who lived 2 doors down and had, as far as I could tell, no family visiting her at all except a daughter who called on Sundays. She was in her 70s, moved slowly, and always seemed to be out in the hallway watering a small collection of plants she kept near her door whenever I was struggling with grocery bags or the mail. The first time she really spoke to me at length was a day my mother had left 20 minutes earlier after a visit that left me sitting on the stairwell landing outside my apartment, catching my breath, because going back inside inside immediately felt like more than I could manage. My neighbor found me there and asked gently if everything was all right. I told her I was fine, the automatic answer I gave everyone by that point. She didn't push, but she said something I've thought about often since. I hear more than people think I do through these walls. If you ever need someone to say what they saw, I will say it. I thanked her and didn't think much of it at the time. I had no idea how much that offer would come to matter later. My blood pressure numbers climbed again at my next appointment. My doctor sat across from me with a more serious expression than she'd used before and told me she needed me taking this seriously, not just her advice about food and rest, but the broader picture of my stress levels. She used the word concerning. She asked directly if there was something going on at home that I wasn't telling her about. I said no. I said the pregnancy was just harder than I expected with twins, and that my husband being gone made everything feel heavier. Both of those things were true. I just left out the parts about my mother's key, and the borrowed money that never came back, and the word gold digger that had started following me around my own apartment like something I couldn't shake off my sleeve. Something shifted in me after that doctor's appointment, though it wasn't dramatic. I didn't confront anyone or set new boundaries or do any of the things a stronger version of myself probably should have done immediately. What I did instead was quieter. I started keeping a folder. It began almost accidentally. I saved a text message from my brother asking for money, thinking I might need it later if he denied ever asking. Then I saved another. Then I started writing down dates next to each one and amounts in a small notebook I kept in the drawer beside the couch. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I told myself that repeatedly. I was just keeping track, the way I'd keep track of any client's invoices, because keeping careful records was simply how my brain worked after years of freelance bookkeeping. I didn't tell my husband about the folder or about most of what was going into it. Our calls were short and often interrupted, and I'd made an unspoken decision early in the deployment to keep our conversations focused on things that felt hopeful. Baby names, the neighbor's cat that had started following me on walks, the absurd cake I'd bought at midnight during a craving so specific I couldn't ignore it. I didn't mention my mother's visits in any real detail. When he asked how things were with my family, I said fine and mostly changed the subject. For a few weeks that summer, things actually did calm down, or at least they appeared to. My mother's visits became less frequent. My brother stopped asking for money as often. I let myself believe cautiously that maybe the worst of it had passed, that pregnancy hormones and stress had made everything feel more dramatic than it actually was, that my family had simply needed time to adjust to a new dynamic and had finally settled into something more reasonable. I even had a good visit with my mother during that stretch. She brought a box of baby clothes that had belonged to me and my brother when we were infants, faded but carefully preserved, and for an afternoon she talked about my own babyhood with something that felt like real warmth. She held my hand at one point and said she was proud of me for how hard I'd worked to have these babies. I cried, grateful, thinking maybe we'd turned some kind of corner. I know now how naive that hope was. I think I knew it even then, somewhere underneath the relief, but I wanted so badly for it to be true that I let myself believe it anyway. People do that. They mistake a lull for a resolution, especially when the alternative is admitting that nothing has actually changed and the calm is just weather, not climate. The lull lasted about 3 weeks. Then my brother needed money for what he called an emergency, and the whole cycle started again, except worse this time, because now there was less pretense involved. The mask, if it had ever really been one, came off faster the second time around. I haven't mentioned my brother's girlfriend yet, mostly because she orbited the situation without ever fully entering it, showing up occasionally at family gatherings and disappearing again for months at a time. She came around more in month 7, right as things were escalating again after that brief false calm, and her presence added a different flavor to the visits that somehow made everything feel worse rather than better. She wasn't cruel in the same direct way my mother was. She was cruel in the smaller sideways way some people are, the kind that lets them claim afterward that they never actually said anything wrong. She'd comment on my swollen ankles with a tone that sounded sympathetic but landed like an insult. She'd ask pointed questions about how much the nursery furniture cost, phrased as innocent curiosity, then repeat the numbers back to my mother later like evidence in a case I didn't know was being built against me. One afternoon, she was in my apartment when my brother asked for money again, this time for something involving a friend's moving truck rental he'd apparently agreed to cover. I said no, firmly, for maybe the first time in months, explaining that I'd already given him significant money that year that had never been repaid, and that I needed to keep what remained for the babies. She laughed, not unkindly exactly, but in a way that made clear she found my resistance amusing rather than reasonable. Wow, she said. Didn't realize you'd gotten so stingy since the wedding. Guess that's what happens when you marry into money. I told her evenly that my husband's paycheck wasn't infinite, that we budgeted carefully for 2 babies who would need everything from diapers to eventual college funds, that generosity toward extended family had limits even in households with steady income. She shrugged like the explanation bored her and changed the subject to something about a sale at a store neither of us had ever discussed before. My mother, overhearing part of this exchange from the other room, came in to add her own commentary, agreeing loudly that I'd changed, that pregnancy had made me selfish in ways she hadn't expected from a daughter she'd raised to understand the value of family loyalty. I sat there, 7 months pregnant, absorbing all of it, and said nothing in my own defense because I had learned by then that defending myself rarely shortened these conversations. It usually just extended them. That evening, after they'd all finally left, I added another entry to the folder still tucked beside the couch cushions. A date, an amount that had been requested, and the amount I'd actually refused to give, which felt like its own small victory, even though nobody in that room had acknowledged it as one. I sat with the notebook open for a long time afterward, afterward, looking at the growing list of entries, and felt something I hadn't quite let myself feel before. Not just exhaustion, but a kind of clarity starting to form underneath it. The sense that I was documenting something real rather than just imagining slights that weren't actually there. The pattern existed. I could see it laid out in dates and numbers, undeniable in a way that feelings alone sometimes aren't. My brother's emergency turned out to be a car repair he needed done immediately, or he'd lose the job he'd just started, a job that required reliable transportation to a warehouse 40 minutes outside town. He asked for $300. When I hesitated, genuinely unsure whether I had that much easily available without dipping into money set aside for the babies, my mother got involved on his behalf, calling me that same evening to explain how selfish I was being. "You have a husband with a paycheck," she said. "Your brother has nothing. This is what family does for each other." I gave him the money. I'm not going to pretend I put up much of a fight because I think it matters to the shape of what happened later. I wasn't a victim who never had agency in any of this. I made choices, mostly out of exhaustion and a desire to avoid conflict during a pregnancy that already felt physically difficult enough without adding a war with my own mother on top of it. Every time I gave in, though, it confirmed something for both of them. It taught them that pushing eventually worked, that persistence would wear me down past the point of resistance. The visits became more frequent again after that and more openly invasive. My mother stopped pretending the key was for emergencies. She'd let herself in whenever she wanted, sometimes while I was in the shower, once while I was asleep on the couch in the middle of the afternoon, exhausted from a morning of back pain that had kept me up most of the previous night. I woke up that day to find her standing over me, arms crossed, asking why I was sleeping the day away when there were things that needed doing. I asked her what things. She gestured vaguely at the apartment, at me, at the general state of my existence, and said something about how she used to work through both her pregnancies without any of this rest I seemed to require. My brother started coming with her more often too, and his presence usually meant something of mine went missing from the counter or the coffee table. A 20 here, a gift card I'd forgotten about there. Once, an entire bag of the specific protein supplements my doctor had recommended, gone from the pantry, with my brother later claiming he'd needed them more than I did because he was trying to put on muscle for a new job that required physical labor. I called my doctor's office in month 7, not for an appointment, but because I genuinely didn't know who else to call about how tight my chest felt some mornings, how my hands sometimes shook without any clear reason. The nurse who took my call suggested I come in early, and when I did, my doctor looked at my numbers and then looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Something is happening in your life that's affecting your body," she said. "I'm not asking you to tell me what it is if you're not ready. I'm telling you that your body is telling both of us it needs to stop." I sat in that exam room and for the first time actually said some of it out loud. Not all of it. Not the key, specifically, or the exact dollar amounts, but I told her my family had become a source of significant stress, that I felt unable to say no to demands that kept growing, that I hadn't told my husband because he was overseas and there was nothing he could do about it from there anyway. She listened without judgment and then said something I've carried with me since. "There is nothing you can do about it. From there is not the same as there is nothing anyone can do about it. You have more options than you think you do. You just haven't used any of them yet." I didn't use any of them that day either, but something about hearing it out loud from someone outside the situation made the folder in my drawer feel less like paranoia and more like preparation. My neighbor and I grew closer over those final months, in the quiet way neighbors sometimes do when one of them is going through something the other recognizes without needing it explained in detail. She started leaving small containers of soup outside my door on days I looked particularly tired, never commenting on it directly, just letting me find them there like a fact of the building rather than a gesture from a person. One afternoon in month 8, she caught me in the hallway right after my mother and brother had left, and I must have looked worse than I realized because she set down her watering can and simply asked if I wanted to sit with her a few minutes. I did. Her apartment smelled like cardamom and old books, and she made tea without asking if I wanted any, just handed me a cup and let me sit in silence until I was ready to talk or not talk, whichever I needed. I told her some of it that day. Not everything, but more than I'd told anyone besides my doctor. The key, the money my brother had borrowed and never once repaid, the word gold digger, which by then felt less like an insult and more like a label they'd assigned me permanently, the way you'd name a pet or a chore. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something quietly that I've never forgotten. "Some people only respect what they're afraid of losing. If they aren't afraid of you, they'll keep taking until someone stops them for you." I didn't fully understand what she meant until much later. At the time, I just nodded and thanked her for the tea and went back to my apartment feeling, if not better exactly, at least less alone in it. My husband's deployment timeline shifted in the final weeks before everything happened, though I didn't know it yet. There'd been talk of an extension earlier in his rotation, uncertainty about exact return dates that had become such a normal part of military life that I'd stopped asking for specifics, just waiting for whatever update eventually came through official channels. What I didn't know was that the extension had been reversed, quietly, and that orders had come through moving his return date up by nearly a week, information that hadn't reached me yet because he wanted to surprise me rather than risk getting my hopes up over something that could still change. In the days right before the incident, small things happened that I only understood the significance of afterward. My brother mentioned, almost as an aside, that he needed money again, something about a friend he owed for helping with the car repair from before. My mother brought up the topic of family loyalty twice in one visit, a phrase she'd never used quite that directly before, as though she were building towards something rather than simply making conversation. I didn't think much of any of it in the moment. Looking back, I recognize it now as the last stretch of pressure building before something finally broke. The way weather gets strange and still right before a storm actually arrives, and you don't notice the stillness as a warning sign until you're already standing in the middle of the rain. The morning it happened started like most mornings that final month. I woke up early because sleeping through the night had become nearly impossible with twins pressing against every part of my ribcage that wanted to expand. I made myself half a cup of decaf I barely finished, stood barefoot on the kitchen tile because the cold felt good against swollen feet, and read through the grocery list I'd need to take care of before my doctor's appointment later that week. I put grocery money in an envelope on the counter, the same way I had every week since the deployment began, using the allotment that came in regularly and covered our expenses without much room for anything extra. I set it down, went to grab my shoes from the hall closet, and by the time I came back into the kitchen, my mother was already standing there, envelope in hand, reading the amount written on the outside like she had every right to know it. "Whose money is this?" she asked, though we both already knew the answer, and I understood from her tone that she wasn't actually asking a question. She was opening an argument she'd already decided the ending of. "Mine," I said, "for groceries." She set the envelope down hard enough that it made a sound against the counter. "That's his money," she said. "His paycheck, his sacrifice, and you're spending it like you earned it yourself." My brother came in from the hallway at that point, drawn by her raised voice, and leaned against the doorframe with the particular grin he wore whenever he sensed an argument brewing that he wouldn't be the target of. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I'd had my own income since well before my husband ever entered the picture, that I still took on bookkeeping clients when I had the energy for it, that the money in that envelope was for food my doctor specifically wanted me eating regularly for the sake of the twins. She waved a hand, dismissing all of it in a single gesture. "Doctors," she said, "shakes and supplements and all this fuss. In my day, we just ate what we could afford and didn't complain about it." I felt something tighten in my chest, the same tightness my own doctor had asked me about weeks earlier, and I told her, more firmly this time, that I needed her to stop coming into my home unannounced and going through things that belonged to me and my husband. I said the word ours deliberately because I wanted her to hear it. That's when she said the thing that had been building for months, delivered flatly, like a verdict rather than an insult. "You're not part of this family because you love him. You're part of it because you found a paycheck and decided that was good enough." My brother laughed, not a small laugh, a real one, the kind that filled the kitchen and made it clear he agreed completely and found the whole situation entertaining rather than upsetting. I told her that wasn't true, that we had tried for these babies for nearly 2 years before anything worked, that I had cried over negative pregnancy tests more times than I could count, that love had nothing to do with money and never had for either of us. My voice was shaking by the time I finished, and I hated that it was shaking because I knew she'd read the shaking as weakness rather than emotion. She stepped closer, close enough that I instinctively moved back a step, my hand going to my belly the way it always did when I felt unsafe. "Ashamed," she said. "That's what you should be. Trapping a soldier with babies while he's too far away to see what you really are." I said the word stop once, quietly, and I think that's what finally set her off completely. The fact that I'd said it at all, that after months of absorbing everything without pushback, I'd finally drawn a line, even a small one. She grabbed my wrist first, hard enough that I felt it in my shoulder immediately, and when I pulled back instinctively, I lost my footing on the edge of the kitchen rug. My shoulder hit the wall beside our wedding photo, hard enough that the frame jumped off its hook and hit the floor face down, the glass inside it cracking audibly against the baseboard. For a second, the kitchen went completely silent, except for the refrigerator humming in the background, the sound suddenly enormous in the quiet. Then she spat right onto the sleeve of my shirt, and my brother laughed again, louder this time, and said something about gold diggers finally getting exactly what was coming to them. I put my hand over my belly and stood there, not saying anything, waiting for whatever came next, the way I'd learned to wait through every visit that had started with a key I never gave anyone the right to use. That's when the front door opened. Boots landed on the hallway carpet, still dark with rain from outside, and my husband stepped into the doorway of our kitchen a full week earlier than any of us had expected him. Nobody moved. My mother's hand was still half raised from where she'd grabbed me a moment before. My brother's grin was still frozen on his face, not yet aware that the audience for his laughter had just changed entirely. I stood there with my hand on my belly, one shoulder throbbing where it had hit the wall, and watched my husband take in the scene in front of him with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, not once in the entire time I'd known him. His eyes moved from the cracked wedding photo on the floor to the mark rising on my cheek where my mother's hand had connected, to the envelope of grocery money still sitting on the counter where she'd left it after tearing it out of my grip. He didn't raise his voice. That was the part that seemed to frighten my mother and brother more than yelling ever could have. The flat, quiet control in the question he finally asked, "Who hit her?" My brother's grin disappeared entirely, like it had never existed in the first place. My mother started talking fast, words tumbling over each other about misunderstandings and things looking worse than they actually were, and my husband held up one hand, and she stopped mid-sentence, the way people do when they suddenly realize the ground under them has shifted. "I've been recording for the last several minutes," he said, from the moment I walked up to the door and heard raised voices inside. "My sister is already on speaker with the family readiness office, and they've heard everything that's happened in this apartment since I opened that door." My mother's face went pale in a way I had genuinely never seen before, not in 31 years of watching her navigate every argument she'd ever started. My brother took a step back toward the hallway, as though the floor beneath him had suddenly gotten too hot to stand on comfortably. Neither of them said another word. My husband didn't look at either of them again after that. He knelt down in front of me instead, both hands moving gently to my belly, and one of the twins kicked hard against his palm, as though even they understood that something in the room had just changed permanently. He asked if I was hurt anywhere else besides my shoulder. I told him no, just the shoulder, and that my brother had taken money from that same envelope 2 days before this, and nobody in that kitchen had said a single word to him about it. My husband stood back up slowly, still facing my mother, and told her she had exactly until he finished standing to put the spare apartment key on the counter. Her hand was shaking when she finally set it down. Then he told them both to leave. He didn't need to raise his voice for either of them to understand he meant it completely. My neighbor opened her door as they walked past it, silver hair still pinned back from an afternoon of watering plants, and I heard her say clearly, to no one in particular, that she'd heard everything through the walls and would say exactly what she'd heard if anyone ever asked her to. My mother didn't answer her. She just kept walking, my brother trailing behind her, both of them disappearing down the stairwell without looking back at the apartment they'd let themselves into for the last time. My husband stood in the doorway for a moment after they'd gone, watching the empty stairwell like he expected one of them to come back with some final argument, some last attempt to reframe what had just happened into something more forgivable. Neither of them did. The building stayed quiet, except for rain still tapping against the hallway windows, and, somewhere below, a car door closing twice in quick succession. He closed the door slowly and turned the deadbolt, an old habit from a lifetime of securing spaces that had nothing to do with our apartment specifically, and knelt back down in front of me on the kitchen floor. Both hands returned to my belly where the twins were still moving, more active now than they'd been in weeks, as though even they had felt something shift in the room around them. The picture frame was still lying face down near the baseboard, glass cracked but not scattered, and he glanced at it once without moving to pick it up yet, like there would be time for that later, and this moment mattered more right now than the mess on the floor. He looked up at me and asked quietly how long this had actually been going on. Not accusingly, just quietly, like he already suspected the answer was longer than anything I'd told him over our calls that year. I didn't answer right away. My shoulder was throbbing steadily now that the adrenaline had started to fade, and one of the twins pressed hard against his palm again, insistent, as though impatient for whatever came next in a conversation that hadn't fully started yet. I just let myself breathe, fully, for the first time in longer than I could remember, while the rain kept tapping against the window behind us, and the grocery envelope sat crumpled on the counter, forgotten entirely the moment the door opened.